Righty, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Leadership, Courage, and Cultural Policy in Times of Uncertainty. My name is Jamie Sharp, and I am the Senior Program Manager here at Grantmakers in the Arts. I use she or any pronouns. I'm a light-skinned Black person in my 20s. I have an afro, and I'm wearing a green sweater today in honor of St. Patty's, of course. Happy St. Patty's Day, and happy Election Day for many of us as well. What a timely day to have this conversation around civic engagement. GIA is headquartered on the unceded land of the Lenape and Wappinger peoples. We ask you to join in acknowledging the Lenape and Wappinger communities, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. A couple of reminders before we get started. Today's webinar will be recorded and shared, and any questions that we don't get to that may pop up in the chat or in the Q&A, we promise we will share them with our speakers and email their responses out to you after the webinar. Be sure that you're reviewing your Zoom features so that you have an optimal experience with us today. If you have a question for our tech team during the webinar, feel free to use the chat function and message LGC Tech Jess. Otherwise, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our presenters. We want this to be a really interactive discussion today, so we encourage you not only to submit questions in the Q&A, but please sound off, share your own experiences that you have with us in the chat. And if you'd like your experience to include live captioning, please select the closed caption or CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select show subtitles. As cultural institutions and funders navigate heightened political scrutiny, public pressure, and renewed culture wars, leadership in the arts is increasingly shaped by moments of choice. Decisions about funding, government, and public engagement now carry implications not only for organizations, but for public commons, the shared civic spaces, narratives, and relationships that make collective life possible. Today's webinar explores leadership and courage as cultural policy practices, grounded in the realities of today's civic landscape. Rather than focusing solely on crisis response, the session examines how cultural policy and cultural organizing practices must help repair trust, strengthen the civic we, and support communities navigating forms of civic trauma and disorientation. This conversation brings together cultural policy thinkers and city-based leaders working in places such as Seattle and Minneapolis, alongside reflections informed by decades of cultural policy research and practice. Participants will explore how leaders make choices under pressure, how risk is shared or shifted, how belonging is expanded or narrowed, and how cultural inquiry can be protected even when cultural expression is contested. Now, without further ado, I'd love to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. So if folks want to go ahead and come on screen, and then Jess, if you could pin them. And Randy, I would love to start with you. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning to those of you in the West and afternoon to those of you further east. My name is Randy Engstrom. I use he, him pronouns. I am wearing a green vest, also in honor of St. Patrick's Day, and a green patterned shirt. Solidly middle-aged white man. And I am the principal and co-founder of Third Bay Creative, a collaborative consulting studio based in Seattle, Washington, but working throughout the US and Canada. And also spent 9 years as a board chair, or as a board member of Grantmakers in the Arts, and 9 years as the director of the Office of Arts and Culture for the city of Seattle. Today, I'm largely going to be talking about the experience as evidenced in these pictures of serving as a co-lead for Mayor Katie Wilson's transition team for arts, culture, and the creative economy, and the courage that I perceive of leading with arts, culture, and creative economy with a new administration coming into a city at a really tenuous moment in our country. Honored to be with you. I also just want to say that Roberto Bedoya has been a friend and mentor to me for many years. I'm excited to hear what he has to say. And I think we're all watching what's happening in Minneapolis with great care and interest, and excited to hear what Teresa has to share with us as well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Randy. And Roberto, please.
Good morning. It's 11 o'clock in Oakland, California, where I live. I'm the former cultural affairs manager for the city of Oakland, but currently I'm a writer and I guess I'm a cultural strategist, more like I just I just like to stir the pot up, see what see what comes to surface. Um, I've as a writer, I've written about placemaking and I had this and about spatial justice and about race. All of those things have been part of my body of writing. Most recently, I read a new article called The Courage of Imagination, a pro-democracy movement and the civic we, which I'll talk a little bit about. But as I think in this particular moment, the stress that we're facing, it offers some commentary on that. So I'll put it to Teresa.
Thank you. Well, I'm really excited to be here. I'm honored to be here with Randy and Roberto as well. And excited to hear what you have to say. I'm Teresa Sweetland, she, her pronouns. I'm a middle-aged white woman with ginger hair and a green sweater dress on today for St. Patty's. I'm the executive director of Forecast Public Art in St. Paul, Minnesota, on the ancestral Dakota homelands. And I've spent about 25 years working in arts nonprofits in Minnesota. So, first, I was executive director at Intermedia Arts, which is a community cultural space working with artists in a social justice practice. And then, after getting my master's in planning, I have been almost 10 years now at Forecast, working with artists in public and civic practice, doing cultural policy, cultural planning, and grant making. Um, so when I was invited to speak about courage and uncertainty and leadership, I felt very compelled to talk about what's happening in Minnesota. And thank you to Randy and Roberto for giving me the space to do that and just talk about kind of what I'm learning as a leader and how it's influencing our work, my work and our work at Forecast. So I live in South Minneapolis. I've lived here for 30 years. Over the past months, if you live here or you've seen us on the news or heard what's happening in our communities, we've been experiencing the largest federal immigration enforcement action in U.S. history. And I would say we've put up one hell of a resistance and a very creative one from the images that you can see here of incredible artists and community members showing up and showing out to defend democracy and our rights. You've probably seen the protests, but I also just want to highlight the incredible neighboring that's happening. Neighbors showing up for each other through mutual aid and protection and support, and really hyper local networks of care that really formed overnight in neighborhoods across the state. And through all of this, Minnesota artists have been on the front lines, and I just want to shout them out and give them the love and value that they deserve for this. They're witnessing what's happening, documenting, bringing joy and ceremony and solidarity for communities, and doing a lot of healing and care work as well. And when I kind of step back and try and understand what's happening here for ourselves and for others and what we take away from this, there's this image that I saw recently about this is not a protest story, this is a civic defense manual. And I think that's really stuck with me about what we can take away from what's been happening and is still happening here in Minnesota. So I think about how that influences cultural policy and leadership and investments we're taking right now. And um, I think about why we're seeing such incredible people-led courage in Minnesota and what it is about Minnesota. We have these deep traditions of collective organizing and collective action, and we've really invested in it. So from Dakota and Anishinaabe resistance and survival movements, we have longstanding labor and farm movements. We have faith networks that have supported refugees from Laos and Somalia. And, 6 years ago now, after the murder of George Floyd, we started to form like really incredible networks of mutual aid here that have been in existence for 6 years. So we also vote at some of the highest rates in the country. We volunteer at some of the highest rates in the country. We heavily invest in social support networks and social cohesion and health. And We also are the highest per capita funder, public funder of arts in the country. And so we care about arts and we see it as integral to our economy, our health, our society, our infrastructure, and everything else. And so, we're also the Wellstone state, and we have a value that comes from that work and his leadership of we all do better when we all do better. And I think that's what we've seen in the resistance movement here in Minnesota. And so I think it's that strength from community and investment and public and private funding that's woven this really strong fabric that allowed us to be have such strength in resistance. And as a leader right now, I think this moment for me is pushing me to think differently about priorities and values and the language that we're using. So we're hosting conversations and learning circles this year called Creative Power Civic Purpose. Um, we are asking the question of how artists strengthen democracy, really inspired by the incredible artists here in Minnesota and across the country that have always been engaged in democracy work. We're asking what's the relationship between civic health and civic defense, and how can we support those? So I just want to bring to life a little bit how I'm seeing Minnesota as a case study about civic health and civic defense with this great fence, of a neighbor here in Minnesota. This civic health work that, the sign that says we love our neighbors, right? The civic health work of community building and relationship building and trust and belonging that we need for such a strong democracy, but also the ice out sign, right? That civic defense that we're seeing, that is a different muscle that we're seeing in our community that comes out when people need to rapidly organize, protect people, protect our rights, protect our democratic norms when institutions are failing and actually causing people harm. And, I think this is what happens when communities work really quickly to protect people. And right now, I'll just share as well, one of our great national funders, the Minnesota-based McKnight Foundation, created these incredible images to help bring, I think, this same concept to life, which is the roles that Minnesotans are playing. The role of neighbor, I show up, I give care, um, I support, I give mutual aid, and the role of defender, the role to observe and preserve families' dignities, justice, and democracy. And I think one thing that this time is really revealing to me as a leader is that we need both of those leadership muscles. I think I was brought up with incredible organizers that taught me about community organizing and how we do that work at the speed of relationships, and often that's very slow and relational work, and we take the time we need to build community. But I also see that civic crisis and the threat to democracy calls for a different leadership muscle right now that is, when we see our neighbors pulled from cars and taken from their homes and killed on our streets, right? We have to act immediately. And so I think listening and learning and also moving quickly is something that I'm learning about these uncertain times. So I just want to share one response that we've taken as an organization. We predominantly work with artists, like I said, in public and civic practice, and we saw artists showing up on the front lines. And so we really wanted to support them. So we started a rapid response fund called Artists as Witness. We just took money out of our general operating fund, $20,000. Weren't sure where it was going to come from, but we had faith that it was the right thing to do. Within a few days, we put together a fund, $1,000 for artists to document what's happening, to be witness, to create spaces for healing and repair. And 123 artists applied from all over the country. All over the state of Minnesota. And we so far, with our own funding and additional funding that's come in to support, have been able to fund 44 artists and culture bearers. They're doing poetry, theater, documentary, film, zines, comics, dance, music, storytelling, and they're preserving social histories. Some artists are marking sites of ICE arrests. They're countering racism and disinformation. They're creating spaces for dignity and truth and belonging. And so we're really honored to support these artists. We hope to support more and continue to see them, um, advance the work that is part of our mission, which is advancing justice. And so I just want to uplift as well that so many artists were on the front lines, arts organizations followed, and then a coalition of funders from the Midwest created a Minnesota Arts Rise and Response fund of 330,000 additional dollars to help support organizations and artists that were already on the ground doing this work. And I think that's ongoing. So thank you to that fund as well for coming through. So I think that's really what courage and cultural leadership is looking like right now. It's really listening and trusting what's happening on the ground and supporting their work. And I just want to end with I've really been following Jelani Cobb, Dean of Journalism at Columbia College, and his work and his speaking and his writing about in democracy, the fundamental civic unit is neighbor. And I really feel like we've seen that so vividly in Minnesota, and that artists are helping us practice neighboring. And we've started using neighboring as a verb, right? We're neighboring with each other. So I can't wait to have that engaged in the conversation and talk more about that, how it relates to policy. And I just think that for our field and for cultural policy to work as quickly and responsively as artists and communities are on the ground is the challenge for us today. So thank you so much for letting me share about Minnesota, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And I just we got a question during that about speaker materials being shared. So yes, everyone will receive the slides, the photos that are being shared today via email after the conclusion of the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started with our questions, but just a reminder to attendees to please submit any questions that you have for our speakers in the Q&A. Our first question is, when we talk about the public commons, what are we actually referring to in cultural policy terms, and where does it show up in practice? So whoever would like to begin.
I'll start off. As a public funder when I was in Oakland and worked most of my career as a public funder in the area of governance and government, it has led me to sort of think long and hard about the civic we. And I'll be metaphorical because that's kind of like where I feel most comfortable. So when we did the cultural plan in Oakland, we was called belonging in Oakland. And belonging is, a catchy word and everybody wants to belong. And then how do you operationalize belonging? Became the homework assignment. So Teresa's story is a brilliant example of having a sense of we, having a sense of the civic we. When I mean the we, I mean not the we of me and my friends kind of privatized we. It's that specular, secular we, and the most ideal sense, we the people. And I think MAGA authoritarianism is all about privatizing that we, getting rid of the secular space, attacking school teachers, attacking nurses, attacking the public support systems, the public infrastructure, because it scaffolds the we, and it's that's where the war, the cultural war, is at. And so, how do we operate in our various little platforms to sustain and support a civic we, affirm a civic we, allow it to sort of create those images, those songs, those movements that kind of shape the we in in a way that is emancipatory and liberating. So I'm all about the civic we, for better and worse.
Yeah, I'll add to that. When Mayor Wilson was running for office, the message that sort of drove her campaign was the notion of this is your city. And so I think the question when she was elected was, how do you operationalize that concept? How do you try to really engage that we that Roberto was just describing, and that I think was evidenced by a lot of what Teresa talked about. And she did something that was pretty unusual, having observed a lot of mayoral transitions in my time in Seattle, because we haven't had a two-term mayor in more than 2 decades. Um, she invited two co-chairs around 8 policy areas, and culture, creative economy, arts, culture, and creative economy was one of them, to engage as many people as possible over a 2-month window and really try to A, hear what is and is not working, and B, what ideas might actually make a material difference in people's lives. And through, you know, I have to give a lot of credit to our team of 8 folks that was on the arts, culture, and creative economy team. We talked directly to over 700 people. We put surveys out to thousands. We held drop-in meetings. We had town halls. We had so many different types of engagement. And I think what was what was interesting to me was, one, the fear is real, the affordability crisis, which has been discussed broadly in every community across this country, the the existential threat of what's happening at the federal level, and we were watching what was happening in Minneapolis in real time as we were having these conversations. And Seattle does have a reputation for being a bit of a progressive city, so we see ourselves in that frame with our friends in Minneapolis and Chicago and Los Angeles. And what role might the arts play in that context? In this context of a moment of another civic trauma? I heard my friend and colleague Mark Folk last night described that we're living through a second pandemic. This one is a bit more man-made than the first, but there really is a collapse of so much infrastructure that folks have depended on to maintain their daily lives. In some cases, that same infrastructure is being used to weaponize the government against communities, like we're seeing in Teresa City. So, what is the opportunity that culture might play in a way that also then can reciprocally support the cultural ecosystem of a place? And I think that gets back to this notion of, in aligned with that notion of civic defense that Teresa talked about. How do we animate our values? How do we platform a set of shared beliefs that can be the connective tissue that can foster that belonging for a city or a community, to be able to practice the neighboring, to be able to practice things like mutual aid at scale? What can government learn from organizing, and allow it to be more responsive to the needs of its people? And I think of the 8 policy areas, we had our final presentation just a few weeks ago, to back out to the community. There was so much commonality. There was so much consistency around what made us who we are, what connected us as residents, as neighbors, as voters, as people. And I'm really interested to see, we can get into this later, but like, what are the policy interventions that can help us get closer to that? What are the ways in which we build the infrastructure that allows for those civic narrative strategies to advance a collective story of a place, and allows us to affirm who we are and how we can take care of each other?
Teresa, did you want to
Yeah.
add?
Teresa, do you want to go ahead? No. Uh, you know, I appreciate. I'm sitting in the circle realizing that I'm the elder. I'm AI, ancestor intelligence, because I've been around the block a few times. So you talk about kind of the culture wars. I was a co-plaintiff in the NEA, Finley versus NEA lawsuit, so I have that history. So in some ways, that is an example for me how we're always have to be adamant about maintaining our civil practices and our civil rights. And so one of the things that I clock is like, how is complicity constructed? That is a counter narrative to that wide open, uncomfortable space of the civic we. And so I just am mindful of like how you you give in to the national attacks on universities, and you don't or on DEI and all the little acts of complicity that are built into that assault, which leads me to this notion of the courage and the courage of imagination. Many years ago, I did a conference in Chicago, I think in the late 80s, called The Courage of Imagination, related to the first Culture Wars battle. And it's courage is um, a sticky word. Define it. What does it look like? And I'm really thinking about um, the bucket brigade, the bucket brigade as an act of courage. It's not the brave person running into the house and saving the individual and the house that's on fire. The house of democracy is on fire. But what does the bucket brigade look at? And I just sort of think about all those local arts councils across the country, the Toledo Arts Commission, how those staff people are sort of the bucket brigades. And they're figuring out the strategies that the localized community needs to deal with in order to deal with the attack on our democracy. And then I guess my last thing is we also have our body memory. We remember the civil rights movement. We remember feminism. We remember queer rights. So it's like it's in our body, and let's not forget it.
Yeah, thank you. That actually transitions us nicely to our next question. So, Randy, you mentioned civic trauma in your response, and Roberto, you mentioned the culture wars. And so, in thinking about like civic trauma, fractured trust, polarization, disorientation, how is that showing up in arts institutions and funding environments today? And where have you seen this most clearly? Teresa, if it's okay, I would love to start with you because you started to touch on this in your presentation, but if you could elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, just staying rooted in Minnesota and thinking about civic trauma, we're a city that had a dual crisis. We had the pandemic in 2020, and we also had the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings after that. An incredible fracture of trust between our civic leaders, our police department, and our people, right? And in particular, communities of color. And so we've been I think we've already been for 6 years really working on rebuilding trust and overcoming the collective trauma that we've experienced as a community. And arts organizations and institutions, I would say, have been deeply engaged in that work, holding space, investing in connections between arts and health and trauma-informed work, and really trying to understand ourselves, what that looks like. What does that look like in practice? What does that look like in our support for artists and communities in this time? To individual artists and arts collectives who've been showing up. I'll just bring attention to, if you've seen the Brass Solidarity group that's been showing up almost every night in Minnesota with instruments and horns and drums and just singing for a community and holding space. They've been every single Monday night at George Floyd Square for 6 years, right? Like working to repair collective trauma with community by playing music together, not supported by necessarily institutions or policies, but because they felt the need so strongly for their own community. So I think that it's happening already in community, led by artists and communities together. And so I think, yeah, we're seeing it. And now it's like, how do we build the infrastructure, like Randy was talking about, for that continued work in our policies and our support to really talk about trust and polarization and trauma and what the anecdote to that, like how do we support that and build that for the long term?
And ultimately, I think that one of the chilling effects of the MAGA moment is that people are afraid. They don't know what their strategy is, and they don't want to get in trouble. And they need to understand that You will get in trouble, but you're in a bucket brigade line. So they're not going to be going after you. Maybe they're going to be going after the we. And so that's the war. The war is the defense of the civic we. And I guess when I was in Oakland, we brought that conversation in the foreground, civic we, in the context of COVID, realizing that the social networks were broken. So how do you reanimate them? And the civic we is a faith system. It's a secular faith. And we just know how to, the work of building trust in that is difficult. And people don't trust government. And yet they want government to be at the table to solve the problem. So let's bring it back down. Like, okay, but let's make it small. You understand governance. How does the community meeting operate? How do the rules at the park operate? How do like the lending library operate? There are all forms of governance that that exist in our lives. And how do we uh, animate them and push them out further?
Yeah, I'm reminded of two quotes, one by an artist named Christina Orbe, who used to live in Seattle, who said the opposite of war isn't peace, the opposite of war is creation. And so, I think when we're in this moment of external threat, it is the courage of imagination, the courage of creation, the strategic value of believing something is possible. And I think that's the thing that's trying to be pushed down or pushed out of our collective um, communities. The other is to go back to our friend Mark Folk a second time. He said, when our North Stars are being dismantled, how do we rewire our constellations? Meaning, how do we find each other and work together, both in our local communities, like the intersection of localism and mutualism? What can Seattle learn from Oakland or from Minneapolis in this moment? We don't have um, the sort of networked infrastructure of federal systems in a way that we once did, in a way that I think was very helpful during the pandemic, for example. So, what are the new networks that we're building? The networks of care, the networks of capacity, the networks of knowledge. How do we share that across geography while also keeping it authentic and rooted in the places where we live and work and exist?
And further to that one, and we're doing a little tag team here, Randy and I, because our guardian angel here is Mark Folk, who's like hovering over us. Toledo, Ohio is in the house, and only to make a joke about the fact that we think a lot and talk about civic imagination. And what does that look like? How do we imagine our lives together? Through song, through story, through movement, through design. So let's put a little muscle behind the notion of civic imagination. And what does that look like? And as policymakers, we know that culture is fluid and policy is sort of rules and regulations. How do you bring them together? How do you work with those energies? And how do you prompt civic imagination and create an apparatus of support for the ways the cultural community does imagine its life together? I saw, and Teresa would probably maybe speak to this a little bit further. Somebody sent me a video of a protest in Minneapolis in which they went to a park and they had all these overhead shot of a butterfly moving. And it was like, wow, that's beautiful. And that's civic imagination as an example.
Yeah, thank you so much. Teresa, did you want to respond?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's an incredible group of artists here that, yeah, really wanted to, I think, bring some hope and positivity. And, artists are doing that all over. But, we really have a lot of artists here who have brought attention to the monarch butterfly, which is a symbol of migration, right, between here in Minnesota and Mexico, and really highlighting the immigrant experience and the immigrant story. And so using the monarch butterfly created by, I think it was 1,000 people that showed up that day to all create this butterfly together. I think it's just like that symbol of solidarity and healing and showing up for each other, right? And knowing, yeah, having a symbol of some kind that we can relate to. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. And I want to call back to the quote, Randy, that you shared, like the opposite of war is creation. Absolutely love that. Gonna write that down in my own personal notes. But and I want to tie that back to Roberto, you were talking about civic imagination, and I'm gonna drop the link in the chat just in a minute here to your reader article that touched on this. But you mentioned that compliancy is a big issue right now, and people are afraid of the moment that we're in. So to the group, I'm wondering, what does courage look like in everyday governance or funding practice, not rhetorically, but structurally, and what kind of decisions bring this into focus?
Well, I'll respond, and maybe it goes to the article. I think of it as how we uh, reanimate and reimagine democracy. It means showing up. It means I'm up for it. You show up at the library and you show up at a talk, you show up at church, you show up at your school, and you talk about the we. And you say, I am part of a community of practice that live together. And we want to make sure that our networks of care, our networks of capacity, our networks of love, our networks of imagination are supported. I mean, the complicity that, I mean, we just guess maybe have to sharpen our apparatus to understand when complicity is being constructed and how to be a counterweight to that.
Yeah, I think one of the lasting impacts of the first pandemic was the way that it broke our ability to be together in space. And I think I've watched the sort of reanimation of people trying to be together in community, to practice togetherness, to practice that neighboring. I mean, certainly an existential threat will animate that very quickly, but I think we're hoping I'm hoping that as a city, we can reestablish, rebuild that muscle around coming together for shared experience, whether that's a parade, a festival, a block party, whatever it is, a quinceañera. Like we have to reestablish the ways in which we experience our community together, because that togetherness is what creates the commons. It's what creates the civic we. When we're all at home on our devices, when we're all trapped in different algorithms and social media feeds, there's a lot of fuel that is amplifying division. And I think what can break through that, what can allow us to actually be in community, is by being together, experiencing something at the same time. And I underestimated, I think, how easily that was lost when we were all physically separated for, the better part of 2 years. And how do we rediscover that? How do we rebuild that muscle?
Uh, Let me add a little something here. And I mean, when I think about civic trauma, I also think about the civic body. And the discourse on trauma in America is pretty much about I've been traumatized by sexism, by racism, and it still resides in the I. And nobody really leads into civic trauma. How have we been traumatized? MAGA is doing this. This is where I'm a big cheerleader for public funders and government, even though it's a beast and I hate it. Uh, but it is a homework assignment. It is the space of the civic we. And philanthropy needs to be aggressive about understanding, especially private philanthropy, their role in constructing the civic we. Going back to Teresa and Minnesota and that slide you showed, knowing my friends there in Jerome Foundation and the city, how everybody has came together to sort of we can do this, you know? And so there are funder, maybe I'm just maybe leading me to the bigger, more philanthropy question. What does mutual aid philanthropy look like, especially in the context of a civic trauma?
Yeah, I what's coming up to me was related to your question relate about risk and what that looks like in decision making. And it made me think about, I might take a little bit of a different turn here, but decision making and funding right now. We are last year, we were launching a new initiative across the Midwest called Midwest Memory. It's a major funding program for rural communities and tribal communities, specifically working on public memory work. And we were about to announce when the executive order came in around DEI. And this work is very specifically about telling the stories of Indigenous community stories and BIPOC community stories in rural places in the Midwest. So we already knew that we were working with folks that had faced hurdles and barriers and exclusion in their communities. And we sort of braced ourselves for thinking like, can this work move forward? And will there be will? Where there be civic and public will in government in these small communities and towns where this was happening? Um, and we really had to make some kind of hard decisions about how we move forward and how much we push and how much we stand back and see what communities we're going to do. And I'll just give one example. We're working with a town in Alger, Ohio. It's a town of 800 people. And the project there is a memorial park and public art effort for a Negro League baseball player named Ray Brown, who grew up in Alger. And when we had given the grant and knew that this was happening as a funder, the town council had already approved the renaming of the park to be the Ray Brown Memorial Park. And as soon as we announced our grant and it went public, there was a door-to-door campaign by some of the members of the community to rescind that naming for what I think most people could see was out of racism. And we were in this tough decision. We are skilled and work with artists and other folks who are skilled at leading tough conversations in community and bringing arts and creative practice into that. But we really decided to let and see what the community and our grantees and the folks would do. And what happened was, I think, really incredible because the community pushed back incredibly hard on this and said, this isn't just a baseball player we didn't know about. This is a son of Alger we didn't know about. This is our neighbor, our family. And an emergency council meeting was called, and people got up. An 80-year-old historian got up and told the entire story of Ray Brown and his family, who had farmed with his family, at the turn of the century. A high school student stood up and said, I kind of feel robbed that I didn't know we had a hometown hero, somebody that won 9 pennants in the Negro League, one of the greatest pitchers of all time in baseball that grew up here. And they pushed the council to change their decision, not only unanimously support this project, but this effort brought in the governor of Ohio, other policymakers, other folks to see how important this is. And now the city is so behind it because they see this as pride of their neighbor, right? Like pride of somebody that's there in their community and a real benefit. So the decision we had to make was actually to not do anything in a time of risk and unknown. And we thought, oh my gosh, this could go really poorly, but letting the community determine the next steps was actually the absolute right move and something we've learned about that community knows what they need often better than we do, obviously, and to move that forward. Roberto, yeah.
I'm going to change the subject a little bit, but I just want to talk about how do we talk about the cultural sector and the cultural infrastructure, and I'm thinking about the civic infrastructure, which is broken. and how, and that means, so I want to do a case study of like, what are the remedies? When I was in City Hall, uh, we had a cultural strategist in government. So I had 12 artists work in 12 departments of government. And Minnesota has got a good history of artists in government and how they help kind of address some of the civic problems. And in order to do that, you need to understand the civic infrastructure is broken. And the remedy is not necessarily always support systems for artists. That is a very important to, but maybe it's a support system for a broken democracy. How do you build I mean, I often joked with my mayor that I got along with, uh, that the city needs to have, it has a transportation strategy, a housing strategy, a workforce development strategy, but it should have a belonging strategy. And you start off with what you have, parks and recs, library, and cultural divisions. They give you the city belonging. So when you kind of like try to think about I guess, the interdisciplinary power of the arts, and as it tries to deal with this assault on our democratic ideals and equity, and we all know it. We need to figure out and maybe get the blessing. And I know that Stanford University is trying to figure out how to have cultural how to have artists in government, and Minneapolis has a great history of that. Seattle probably. We have small little case studies, but can we escalate that up?
I, I'd love to build on that. I mean, I think to me, polarization is largely a function of binary, often false binary choices, Republican, Democrat, tall buildings versus single family housing, parking versus bike lanes. And I think a lot of where government gets trapped in its own process is being stuck in these false binaries. And what I think these cultural strategists, these artists in government do, what artists and creative people do as their practice and way of life all the time is exist in nuance, exist in a variform of options. There's never just two choices. It's always more than that. And I think Teresa's story from Ohio really animates that. You can say that our racialized history makes you feel bad or is good or bad or what, but it doesn't change the fact that it's history. It doesn't change the fact that it happened. And you can't treat an illness that you're unwilling to diagnose. So where is the opportunity to diagnose it and tell a story and to think about the nuance and the humanity and what is gained from that? I think that's an incredible position of strength for a community to grab. And I think when we get stuck in good, bad, right, wrong, yes, no, up, down. I think that we're on this like treadmill that we can't get off of. And so what can artists bring to the process of civic needs, of civic practice, within the institution of government that it so desperately needs? It needs that imagination, maybe more than anywhere else, because it's stuck in a false binary.
Yeah, thank you. I want to uplift a great question we have here from Ella in the chat. Back to the big, beautiful bucket brigade. People are most responsive, organized, and effective in that collective behavior and when the situation is urgent. What's your advice or perspective on sustaining that energy and infrastructure? And this is also just a reminder to our audience to please continue to submit any questions or comments that you have in the chat or the Q&A.
Well, I'll respond to Ella's question. Maybe I'm just an old school, I mean, it takes a long time for change to happen. So, I mean, I understand the urgency of now, but I'm also thinking like, okay, I'm planting the seed, and maybe 7 generations from now we see something different. So to feel comfortable with the fact that some of the remedies are long term, the fact that uh, this cultural strategy uh, programming is starting to happen in smaller cities across the country. And maybe in a decade, people will really be comfortable saying that they're a cultural strategist. So there's a development of a workforce that is no longer, artists are no longer saying, I'm an artist. They're saying, I'm a cultural strategist. And I work in the terrain of policy making. And I make policy arguments via art. Now, that person in the bucket brigade is really important. And I guess I think about democracy in terms of two more things. Uh, I think about the policy arguments that are key to moving the dial inside government, and the policy arrangement. Who's doing what and how are those things being delivered? And understand both of them are really, they're linked, but I guess I lean into it because I'm more like the argument guy. I'm going to put my argument out there. Like the poetics of policy making. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Yeah, I think that the infrastructure that's necessary are the networks of care and the networks of capacity, by which I mean very literally, like the Urban Arts Coalition, the Creative States Coalition, Grant Makers in the Arts, National Performance Network. We can't do this alone. And I think that urgency is hard to maintain, particularly, Roberto and I share a love for local arts agencies, having spent a lot of time there. And those can be some lonely positions because you're often the one doing that work in your home city. So how do you find the others? How do you build a constellation of practice so that you can learn from what they're doing in Minneapolis and Oakland and San Francisco and Toledo and everywhere else? I think that you need to find those networks where you can be held not just as a sort of an intellectual practitioner, but also as a person. I think we need to hold each other as people and hold each other as creators, and those networks are critical to doing that.
Yeah, I'll just uplift what you've already been saying about collective action, the bucket brigade and needing to work together and be in collective action. Um, and just highlight, I think one of the reasons that Minnesota has already had this strong infrastructure that allowed this strong resistance is our incredibly generous legacy bill in Minnesota and our state funding for the arts, not just in urban centers, but in every single county across the state of Minnesota, in every small town and tribal community, and funding those small arts groups, funding those individual artist collectives, funding those core third spaces where people need to go and find each other, funding artists working in schools and healthcare centers and um, corrections facilities and parks, and right, so that there's this um, long-standing investment, decade-long investment by the taxpayers of Minnesota. And that was a collective action, right? That was the arts coming together with the clean water folks and the hunters and fishermen in Minnesota to pass that together to support arts heritage and environment. So that kind of model of collective action is a long-term strategy that builds, a stronger we, right? Because we know, especially with the arts and the outdoors, those are places where people spend time together, build relationships together, connect with each other in ways that they don't in other spaces. So I think that's a strong model to look at, and Sarah, I think is on here and can speak more to that. You follow up on that.
I mean, public policy is sort of the most durable form of mutualism that exists. And I was talking to Ben Johnson a couple of weeks ago. He was describing a lecture about Prince and how did Prince become Prince? How does something like that happen? How do you create like a multi-generational talent like that? And he said that in 1911, the state of Minnesota passed an arts education bill that mandated every school, regardless of size or location, to provide arts education for every student in every classroom. And that is more than anything what they pointed to as the thing that allowed Prince to become Prince. I mean, it had a lot to do with lots of other things, but when every single person is given that access by legislative mandate, then you don't even know what the outcomes might be. You don't even know what that possibility, that imagination might unlock in the future. And I think that's the power of policy when done well, is it can create really, really structural change over time. To Roberto's point, like what if there was more policy to support artists and residents in government or cultural strategists as a function of cultural policy at the municipal level?
Yeah, thank you. And Randy, I think that transitions us nicely into our last question here. But in naming that, I mean, what is like one thing that we could leave the audience with today that we really want to see from leaders that move beyond like protection and support and actually towards repair of the civic trauma and also rebuilding trust with that as well?
I'll just jump in. I'll push a little bit about on the question because I do think that we're not beyond protection at this point. I do think that we need to be supporting frontline protection, defense of democracy, protection against harm in our communities. I don't think what's happening here in Chicago or LA is done. I think we're going to continue to see this assault on our rights and our communities. And so I do think cultural policy needs to stay solidly willing to take the risks to move quickly and rapidly and support communities in that work. And, we also have to, I think arts and culture are one of the best ways to bring communities together after trauma to heal. And so we need to think about those long-term strategies to do that. But I don't want to feel like we're beyond protection at this point. So, and I may have more to add about that, but.
I think that's totally right. Obviously, I mean, I think when you are feeling that threat on your streets day to day, we have to continue to invest in that frontline care. I think that, a book that I'm a big fan of is Decolonizing Wealth, and it's sort of set into pieces, one called Where It Hurts, and second piece is called How We Heal. And I think we need to do both of those things at the same time. The where it hurts, I think, gets back to Teresa's defense construct and the idea that like we have to be honest about where we are and how we got here, not in a way that's accusatory or punitive, but in a way that allows us to understand and properly diagnose how we move forward and heal. And then we can use in his version of it, these decolonized approaches to how we make investments, spend public dollars, and invest in our communities. I'm always going to be a big advocate of unrestricted funding for artists. I think that they know their communities and they hold the keys to all sorts of interventions that have proven time and time again to be the vanguard of what we need to both protect and advance our community's needs. And I think another lesson of the pandemic in those first 6 weeks. I saw the government actually could do whatever it wanted. If it wanted to give away, $500,000 in grocery cards, it could. We said we couldn't for, 80 years, but it turns out when you really needed to, you could. We could move $10,000 grants out the door to small business to the tune of $5 million if we choose to. Everything's a choice, right? And so I think the courage to understand what's really needed and make that choice and not be trapped by the way that Roberto described policy aiming to fix by the rules and regulations that govern the way we do things. We do have the option to invest differently if we have that trust and we have that relationship.
You know, last year when the budget was being debated at City Hall, they aced out the Cultural Affairs uh, Division. And it prompted the community to sort of protest and push back, and it got reinstated. It's an ugly story, but the fact that organizing and advocacy still have power. And even though the technocrats just saw it as an economic liability, and they just wanted to um, get rid of it. It's like, so how do you make the argument and for civic health, civic wealth, civic beauty, and make and build coalitions around that? So that's it for right now. For me, I mean, I can go on forever.
Teresa, you mentioned earlier there you may want to elaborate. Do you want to add anything?
Oh, I mean, I think from leaders to leaders, I think reaching out and being in these conversations together, I feel like last year there were a lot of people feeling very isolated and feeling very alone and feeling unwilling to take risks and afraid. And I feel like we're coming into a different time of being in more collective action and conversation with each other and supporting each other and sharing what's working in other communities with each other. And I think that's about, helps us take more risks in this time and helps us, repair and rebuild our own field, right, which has been under attack as well. And so we need to give that kind of support to our own field and our own policies and our own leaders in communities as well.
I think that's a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much, Teresa, Roberto, and Randy. Jess, if you could please pull up the last slide. Today's conversation reminds us that leadership in the arts is deeply tied to how we steward the public, shared spaces, stories, and relationships that shape civic life. In a moment of heightened political pressure and cultural debate, choices that cultural funders make carry consequences for trust, belonging, and the future of creative expression. At GIA, we remain committed to supporting the field and navigating these complexities with courage, curiosity, and accountability. We invite you to continue this work alongside us to protect space for investing in arts and culture as a vital part of a healthy civic life. Thank you all so much for joining us today. There's a QR code on the screen if you have any feedback. Again, as a reminder, we'll be sending a recording and all of the materials from today's presentation and discussion via email to our attendees and registrants. Thank you all so much.